Hello, I'm Brad Harris, Smithtown Councilman and Town Historian, and I'd like to welcome you to this program on Smithtown's past and present. With these programs, I have been looking at the story of Smithtown's growth and development and attempting to show how that growth has had an impact upon the hamlets and communities that make up Greater Smithtown. Today, as you can see, I am in the heart of downtown Smithtown. At the moment, I am in the immediate area of Smithtown that most people are familiar with, the intersection of Route 111, Middle Country Road, and North Country Road. Most people know this intersection because of the heavy traffic congestion one can find here at almost any time of day. And most likely you have been sitting in traffic at this intersection at some point in your life waiting for the traffic to move. Of course, this intersection wasn't always like this. There was a time when these roads were simply dirt roads that linked together the communities of Smithtown. I don't think traffic jams were a problem when this picture was taken. Life was simpler then, and the town of Smithtown branch, as it was then known, was far different than it is today. And it is that past, the past of Smithtown branch at the turn of the century, that I'd like to bring to you through this program. Smithtown at the turn of the century was actually made up of two distinct communities. There was the community of Head of the River, which was nestled in and around the area where the Smithtown Bowl stands today. And there was the village of Smithtown Branch, which was everything east of Edgewood Avenue along what is known as Main Street, Smithtown today. These two communities were still very rural, and they consisted of several small clusters of buildings surrounded by great open tracts of farmland. We know this since the census of 1900 shows us that the village of Smithtown Branch had only about 700 residents, so the town was very small. Many of the houses that once lined the Main Street of Smithtown Branch are still to be found along Main Street today. And if you look for them, you can find them. Like this one. This house was once the home of Dr. George Fanning, a local doctor who owned one of the first automobiles in Smithtown, a 1901 Locomobile steamer. This house, which now sits back away from Main Street, was actually moved to this location when the Texaco station was built. But this house is important because it was actually the first house which one saw as he entered the community of Smithtown Branch. Further to the east was another home owned by the Hubbs family. Built in the 1870s as a farmer's house, Fred Hubbs purchased this house in 1907 from Melville Brush, and Miss Inez Hubbs still owns it today. And it is still a private residence right on Main Street in Smithtown. Most of the buildings in this area are of very recent vintage. There was a building here, however, where Angelo's restaurant stands today. It had quite a different look at the turn of the century when the railroad crossing was at grade level. In 1900, the building was owned by Everett Hand, and not too long after that, it was purchased by the Schuberts and converted into this hotel. In the 1930s, to improve the safety of the railroad crossing, an underpass was dug as a WPA project. But in this photograph, you can see the road still cross the railroad tracks and the gates are down. A pedestrian is running to get out of the way because a train is coming. The railroad station at the turn of the century had a far different look as well. This photograph showing the water tank and the windmill reminds us that this was the age of the steam locomotive as well, and the trains of the past were quite different from those of today. Main Street in this immediate area had a far different look in 1900 than it does today. This slide, taken sometime in the 1920s, gives an impression of the tree-lined street that once existed here. In the historic photograph, you can see a real estate office that existed when the picture was taken, and is now this building. In the background of the photograph is the building that was Trainer's Hotel at the turn of the century, and is now this building today. Just behind the Sizzler restaurant is another private home which is still used as a residence by the Scott family. The house was built in 1869 by the Redwood family, from which Redwood Lane takes its name. The Redwood House, as it is known, is noteworthy for its relatively unaltered appearance and for the fact that tucked away in a corner of the house is this little carriage shed, which is still standing. Down Redwood Lane, opposite Town Hall, is this building, which today serves as a plumbing shop. This building stood here at the turn of the century, and at one time had a little cupola on top. Beyond the plumbing shop, this building stood. Today it is Edward Brown's law office. We do not know much about this building, except that it was standing here sometime around 1860. Town Hall was built in 1912, and the architect was Lawrence Butler. This is the way it looked when it was first constructed, and this is the way Town Hall looks today. The only addition to this building has been the east wing and the monument in front of Town Hall. But of course, this building was not standing here at the turn of the century. Across the street on the New York Avenue school property is a house that was standing at the turn of the century. The Isaac Arthur House, as it is known, is a very old house. It was built in 1752 and is the only remaining pre-Revolutionary War structure to be found in this end of Smithtown Branch. At the turn of the century, it was owned by Daniel Smith, who ran a livery stable from the barns that were then standing on the property. These stores, which stand directly across from Town Hall, are of recent vintage and hide the house that used to be Brown's hardware store. From this view, you can see the house that was first rented by Joseph Brown in 1904 and has been altered by the addition of a modern facade. Actually, the building is thought to have been built as early as 1858. The other stores here in this commercial district to the east of Town Hall are of more recent vintage. But here, too, you can see how former homes have been converted into commercial establishments. Not too long ago, this site was occupied by the Smithtown Methodist Church and Parsonage, and looked this way. It was here, too, that a bakery once stood on the corner of Maple Avenue and Main Street, just about where this modern bakery stands today. As we look along Main Street to the east from Maple Avenue, we see a number of buildings that were not standing here at the turn of the century. This area was open pasture land owned by a Mr. Charles M. Sanford, who used to have a big house that occupied the site where the Glaymore Ford building is located today. Up until a few years ago, the barns which stood on this property were still there, but were then taken down. Further east of the Sanford house, on the same side of the street, where the movie theater stands today, was the Central Hotel. The Central Hotel used to cater to people who traveled through Smithtown on their way to the eastern end of Long Island, but it burned down many years ago. Across the street from the Central Hotel, about where Bank Street is located, was another home owned by Dr. Carl. He was a local doctor, and his house was one of the few structures on the north side of Main Street at this point. As we look further to the east from the corner of Lawrence Avenue and Main Street, we see the Smithtown Branch Shopping Center. All of these buildings on the south side of Main Street are recent and date from the 1950s when the shopping center was built. At the turn of the century, the entire piece of property from Lawrence Avenue to Singer Lane and south to Miller's Pond was owned by the Miller family. In 1900, Mrs. Mary Miller owned the property, and the Miller home stood just beyond where the Howard Johnson stands today. The Miller home was a magnificent residence, as you can see, and stood proudly in the midst of the 100 acres that Mrs. Miller owned. The house is long gone, having looked this way in 1954, shortly before it was torn down to build the shopping center.